you all for coming this morning. As we're kicking off our fall classes, we have 2 classes going. If any of you want to hear how people with disabilities are constantly confronting issues and hardships, there's a really good lecture that is going to be given next door. However, if you want to explore the book of Exodus, you've come to the right place. All right. This, of course, is Moses. It's an image of Moses parting the Red Sea, right? Just throw that up there. You are very familiar with that. What we're going to do, I thought I always like to, when I begin talking about one of the books of the Bible, to talk about authorship. Where did this book come from? When was it written? What's the purpose of this book? And I thought that in my treatment of Exodus, it should be no different. That I would also begin by exploring with you the provenance of this book. I will just say that I had no idea what I was getting myself into when I started this. Wow. Okay, and so I have my chief goal this morning is to make this comprehensible to you, a very, very layered and textured topic, make it as comprehensible as I can to you without doing too much injustice to the material. All right, first of all, let's start out. I'm assuming I'm just going to start out like you're all college freshmen and you know absolutely nothing, okay? And so we're just going to start out with the basic rudiments of this and follow the book of Exodus within the overall arc of the Old Testament. The book of Exodus makes up one of the 5 books of the teaching of Moses. This is what Torah means, right? Torah means the teachings of Moses. That's what it means, the Torah. So in Jews then refer to the Torah as, or to the first 5 books of the Old Testament as the Torah. You've probably also heard it referred to as the Pentateuch. And this is the Greek word for 5 books, okay? And sometime around the year in the 3rd century BCE, the Hebrew Bible was translated into Greek because many Jews had lost the capability to read Hebrew, but they were fluent in Greek, and so they translated the Hebrew Bible into Greek, and this is called the Septuagint translation. And it's one of the oldest versions of the Bible that we have. But anyway, the term that the translator used to refer to the first 5 books of the Greek Old Testament was the Pentateuch. So you'll hear it referred to as the Torah by Jews, and quite commonly among English-speaking people as the Pentateuch. Okay, so that's just nomenclature. Let me give you just a brief overview, and I'm sure as good Lutherans you have just poured through the Pentateuch forwards and backwards, and you have a pretty good idea of what's going on. But I've just given you a brief synopsis here of what is the Pentateuch actually doing. The book of Genesis opens with a history of creation and of the earliest human societies. It rapidly narrows its aim to God's choice of the patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, who receive his promise of progeny, that is, offsprings and land in the form of covenants. Right. So this is Genesis deals with the creation of mankind, and then narrowing in on the patriarchs, that is, the forefathers of the Israelites, and God makes a covenant with these forefathers. The story of Genesis ends with Jacob and his children in Egypt. Okay, that's Genesis. Exodus tells the story of how God chose Moses to deliver Israel from slavery in Egypt and to lead them across a covenant, to lead them to accept the covenant, so that he would be their God and they would be his people. And the key passages there are chapter 6 around verse 7. The book closes with a detailed description for the building of the tent of meeting and the ark of the covenant, central signs of God's presence within Israel itself. So this God reaffirms his commitment to the children of Jacob, that is Israel, and as part of that covenant, then their obligation is to build a tabernacle and an ark so that God can dwell among them. Leviticus contains the laws and commandments that God gave this newly sanctified people to obey as part of the covenant relationship. These relationships deal mostly with sacrifices, feasts, priesthood, and ritual obligations of worthiness and holiness. Have any of you actually read Leviticus? Yeah, I know. It's a tough slog. It really is. Numbers adds many more laws and regulations about the 12 tribes and their organization as a holy people on the march. Chapters 10 through 21 of Numbers then continue the story of Israel's wanderings in the desert, complete with a 40-year punishment for rebelling against God and Moses. And then finally, the last book of the Torah, of the Pentateuch, is Deuteronomy. This is composed as a speech of Moses as the Israelites. They are on the eastern side of the Jordan River. They are poised to invade the land of Canaan and to take over the land of the Canaanites. But before they do it, Moses gives them one last final set of instructions, and that's what Deuteronomy is. It's a speech purportedly from the mouth of Joseph. It sums up the meaning of the Exodus and the desert journey, and reaffirms the importance of the covenant law as a guide for Israel's life in the promised land. It is Moses' farewell speech, and at the end of which he dies. This is in Deuteronomy chapter 34. So Moses does not make it into the promised land. You all know that. All right. I'm sorry, you're just all bored to tears because, again, as good Lutherans, you knew all of that. But I just want to give you some sense of, Exodus is part of, it's an integral part of the Torah of the first 5 books of the Bible. Any questions, observations? There are no surprises here, right? Yeah. Okay, so let's get down here then to the real issue, and that is the author and date and place of the composition of the book of Exodus. You need to understand that in order to grasp where the book of Exodus actually originated, who wrote it, and why it was written, you can't separate that from the Torah itself, right? It's a part of the Torah. And so, in other words, to understand Exodus and the origins of Exodus and the author and the place of composition, we have to put it in the context of the rest of the Torah. All right, so the traditional view is Moses was the author, right? If someone were to ask you, just generally speaking, who wrote Genesis, you'd say, well, Moses, I guess. Okay, well, that's not much of a stretch. But then who wrote Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy? You'd have to stop and think a little bit, but eventually you'd say probably Moses, right? Because that is the traditional view, that Moses, both among the Jews as well as among Gentiles as well. All right. We are told, as a matter of fact, that Ezra, that is the book of Ezra in the middle of the Old Testament, that Moses was in fact the author of the Torah. And Ezra it's a book in the Old Testament that was written around the year 450 BCE or so. However, nowhere in the Torah, that is in those first 5 books, is the claim made that Moses was writing the text himself. He never says, I, Moses, am writing these things down. Problematic, too, is the description of Moses' death in Deuteronomy 34. How could Moses, if he were writing the book of Deuteronomy, write about his own death? So right there is a thorny problem. As a matter of fact, this caught Martin Luther's attention years and years and years ago, and Martin Luther says it doesn't seem that Moses could have written the book of Deuteronomy since his death is reported at the end. So even as far back as Luther, then, we have questions about the authorship of the text itself. All right, so let's look at what scholarship has told us about the origins of the book of Exodus and of the entire Torah itself. And here, there's a Torah. I'm sorry. There it is. There's just one of many, many scrolls. This is actually one of the oldest extant copies of the Torah. It's in Italy, and it's still used by Jews. I forget which city it's in, but it's still used on a weekly basis to read the teachings of Moses. This fellow, Julius Wellhausen, was a fellow who began to critically analyze and begin to ponder the origins of the entire Torah towards the end of the 19th century. He's right around 1880s, 1890s, something like this. He's a German scholar, German biblical scholar, and he challenged the view that Moses wrote the Pentateuch. As a matter of fact, after looking at the text, he began to notice a number of elements within the text itself, that is the entire Torah or the entire Pentateuch, that gave him real pause to say that not only did Moses not write this, but it probably wasn't the work of just one author at all. For instance, he noticed what have come to be called doublets in the text, and you probably noticed these yourself, and you just sort of glossed over them, but there are frequent repetitions in the text of the same story, right? You'll read one thing in one chapter, and then 4 or 5 chapters later you will read the story, but it's going to be just a little bit different. Just a little bit different. I'll give you an example of this. In the book of Exodus, the first time we are introduced to Moses' father-in-law, he is called Reuel. The next time we are introduced to him, he is called Jethro. Well, let me make this even more accessible to you. There are 2 stories of creation in Genesis. You all know that, right? Genesis chapter 1 and then Genesis chapter 2. These are called doublets, right? Where the same story is repeated, but with certain details change. There are 2 versions of Noah's flood, for that matter, right? One, I think, claims that he's in the ark for 40 days. The other claims he's in the ark for 6 months. Okay, all right. There are also 2 versions of Moses receiving the 10 Commandments. So these sorts of things Wellhausen began to notice, and he began to question why one author then would write the same story twice and actually change it. He also noticed that there were different names for God used in different passages, right? Elohim, Yahweh, El Shaddai, they are, at different points within the text, different names are given for God. And finally, Wellhausen's study of the Pentateuch led him to posit that there were 4 authors or groups of authors behind the first 5 books of the Old Testament. And this has come to be called the documentary hypothesis. Documentary hypothesis. All right, before I go on, do you have any questions about any of this so far? None of this should strike you as being strange because you've all encountered this, right? These doublets in the text and things just a little bit different every now and then, but you've probably never given them much thought because, well, you just haven't. That's all right. That's all right. Okay. Wellhausen argued that each of the 4... he posits that there were 4 authors or groups of authors behind the first 5 books of the Old Testament, and this has come to be called the documentary hypothesis because he came up with this idea based solely upon an analysis of the text itself. So it's documentary evidence within the text itself that he was using to posit that there were actually 4 authors for the entire Torah. All right, and another thing that he noticed was different writing styles and use of vocabulary as well. Okay, there's a huge difference between why do you all know the story of Genesis, but none of you have ever read Leviticus? Because Leviticus is god-awful to read, isn't it? But those first 2 chapters of Genesis are just a rip-roaring tale, aren't they? I mean, you just blow right through those things, right? Think about that. No, think about that. There's a difference in writing style. There's a real difference in writing style, right? And so this is one of the things also that Wellhausen said, why would the same author vary so much in his writing style? All right, so here's what Wellhausen does. He argues that each of the 4 texts were produced in different times in different places, and they were closely linked to the political and social and religious situation in Israel at the time. Okay? So here's the breakdown of his 4 sources. And what we need right here is just a little bit of geography. You're probably all familiar with this. You know that according to Scripture, after King Solomon died, that his kingdom, which encompassed all of this, was broken into 2 parts. Okay, there is the northern kingdom of Israel, and then the southern kingdom of Judah, which contains where's Jerusalem right there. Okay, so we have then by around the year 950, 800 or so, we have 2 kingdoms there in the land of Canaan. We have the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. And looking then at the context and the content of the Pentateuch, Wellhausen believed that he was able to discern where the specific books of the Torah were actually written based upon what was going on in these kingdoms at the time. Okay, so here's a breakdown of his 4 sources. The first source that he posits is called the Elohist author. And he calls the author of this text the Elohist author because the Elohist author uses the name Elohim for God. Right? He calls God Elohim. And so, and there is in the passages, most of the passages where God is being called Elohim in the Hebrew, then he attributes these to this author that he calls the Elohist. All right, this text, the texts that use the name of God Elohim, tend to show favoritism towards the kingdom up here in the north. And place names which occur in the text that is being written by the Elohim pepper all of the land of Israel in the north, right? Very few references to any territory down here at all, but most of the references are up there to the north. The other thing that's interesting is that Elohim is depicted as God removed a step or two from mankind. He communicates only in dreams or via emissaries. Only in dreams or via emissaries. And you may have trouble wrapping your mind around this. Think about Genesis chapter 2, 3, and 4, where God is walking with Adam and talking with Adam, right? Okay, that's not the way that the Elohist author portrays him at all, right? God is away from mankind. God is majestic. God, if he communicates at all with mankind, he'll do it either through dreams or he will send angels, but he never mixes it up with mankind at all. Elements of this text are found in Genesis and Exodus, and altogether they make up about 17% of the Pentateuch. About 17% of the Pentateuch. Wellhausen argued then that this text was composed in the northern kingdom of Israel sometime between 930 and 722. So he dates it coming from this area right up in here, shortly after the foundation of that kingdom. All right, the second author that he detects, the second hand that he detects, he attributes this to an author that he calls the Yahwist author. And he calls him the Yahwist author because when this author refers to God, he always refers to God as Yahweh. Always refers to God as Yahweh. Okay. And for those of you who are familiar with the Hebrew, you know that chapter 1 of Genesis calls God Elohim, and chapter 2 of Genesis calls God Yahweh. Okay? Okay. So right off the bat, right? Wellhausen said this appears to be from two different hands altogether. Okay, two different hands altogether. Okay, now just a little bit. Oh, and there you go. Okay, this is Elohim over here. This is how Elohim is spelled, and this is Yahweh. Okay, this is Yahweh right here. Now, the interesting thing about this is that when Hebrew was originally written, like all Semitic languages, they didn't write in the vowels. Okay, they didn't write in the vowels, and consequently, what this is, it is actually. No, I'm sorry. Y-E-W, what is it? No, sir. W-H. Yeah, Yahweh. Yahweh, okay.
H.
Y-E, oh, that's right.
Y-H. Y-H. W-H. I'm sorry,
there you go. Okay. Yahweh, like that, but there are no vowels in there. The Hebrew text is pointed. That is, the vowels are added sometime in the, around the 8th or 9th century in the Common Era, and that's when they put in the vowels, okay? Y-E-H, no, I'm sorry. W-H-E-W, becomes Yahweh. There we go. Becomes Yahweh. And this then is transliterated as Jehovah into the English. That's why you'll hear Yahweh referred to as Jehovah. I'm sorry that I stumbled through that. No better. All right. The interesting thing about this is that because Wellhausen was German and they don't have a W in German, they use a J. He called him actually so the Yahwist, the Javist, right? The Javist, but that's what I understand. All right. Okay. All right. So elements of this text are found in Genesis and Exodus, and let me see. Oh, let me go on down here. This author depicts an anthropomorphic God who walks and talks and muses, thinks aloud to himself. Think about this in the description of before the flood, right? God said, I really regret having made man, right? Okay, this is the Yahweh God, where God's thinking to himself, and he ruminates, and he goes down and he talks with mankind. He's very anthropomorphic, right? He's very anthropomorphic. That is almost human-like in the way that he acts. He becomes angry, he grows happy, or becomes happy. Okay. Wellhausen, based upon much of the evidence that he finds in the text, many of the place names are located down here in the kingdom of Judah. And so he attributes then the origins of this text, of the Yahweh's text, to writers down here in the kingdom of Judah, probably not much after the Elohist is writing up there in the kingdom of Israel, and around 722 or so. All right. When the northern kingdom of Israel was destroyed in 722 by the Assyrians, you will all remember that, right? The Assyrians come in and they wipe out this kingdom right here, and they literally deport all of the people. Wellhausen argues at this point that some of the priests and the scribes who had that Elohist text came down here into Jerusalem, and they introduced the Elohist text down in Jerusalem, and it was incorporated into the Yahweh's text. Okay, so there's a fusion of these two texts. Okay. All right. Elements of the Yahweh's text are found in Genesis and Exodus and make up about 20% of the Pentateuch. Okay. This is interesting. 20% of the Pentateuch, and this is what you guys know. Right? You guys know the Yahweh's text because it's easy to read, isn't it? It's Genesis and the beginning of Exodus. But boy, when you get to Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy, you just go up your hand and say, whoa, I don't want to know. But what you know is the Yahweh's text and maybe a little bit of the Elohist text because they're much more accessible than the rest of it. Okay, any questions? Yes, please.
If these were written around 700 BCE, is there any other literature that refers to them that they found?
What we'd have to do is to look, does the archaeological evidence bear it out? For instance, when they describe a certain place up there in the northern kingdom, does archaeological evidence actually show that there was a place there? Was it settled at the time? The same thing in the southern kingdom. Okay, and there is archaeological evidence to bear out some of the place names that are being talked about. Yeah. Okay. Yes, please.
I read just this week that Yahweh, YHWH, means past, present, and future, like all in one thing. Is that?
It means existence or being. That's what it means.
It's all happening right at the same thing.
Well, it just means being. That's what it means.
Oh, okay.
It just means being. I am being. I am existence. I am. That's what it means.
The great I am.
I am. Because it's associated with the Hebrew verb for to be, to exist.
Okay.
Yeah, that's what.
Translation like that?
What's that?
Translation like that?
No, not like that. Elohim is actually it's a plural word for gods. And originally, when the Canaanites were up and through here, they worshipped a god by the name of El. And there was a pantheon around him, and they were referred to as Elohim, the gods, right? But eventually that becomes applied to the Hebrew God. But because it's weird, because it's a plural noun, but they use it to refer to a singular God.
Yeah. So Yahweh would be the noun, would be different in that area.
Yeah. Although in terms of their antiquity, they're probably not too far apart from being used.
But other cultures would not use Yahweh.
No, it's strictly Hebrew.
Yeah.
Well, we'll have to be a little bit careful about that. Actually, the worship of Yahweh is actually we can find it actually going on down in this area down here too. Yeah, that's interesting. Okay, there's another author called the Deuteronomist author, and the Deuteronomist author, this author, a group of scribes, wrote the book of Deuteronomy, which means second law in Greek. And God is always referred to in this text as Yahweh. This is interesting because if you read 2 Kings chapter 22, this is describing the rule of the king Josiah. And there is a big to-do because the high priest, Josiah, orders the temple to be refurbished and to be rebuilt because it's fallen into disuse. And the high priest comes running into Josiah and he says, I have found the law of Moses. I have found the law of Moses. This is in 2 Kings, right? And King Josiah immediately then listens to the text as it's being read, and he begins to implement reform, religious reform dedicated to Yahweh based upon that text. And this seems to be Deuteronomy, right? This seems to be Deuteronomy, the book of Deuteronomy. Okay, so we can date this, and the major goal was to abolish the worship of all other gods in Judah and to worship Yahweh alone. Based on the above, Wellhausen dated this text to around 622 BCE. That's around the time of the reign of Josiah, so there's not much controversy over that. Okay, this text makes up about 18% of the Pentateuch, okay, the 18% which you haven't read. Okay, so we got three authors so far. We've got the Yahwist, we've got the Elohist, we've got the author of Deuteronomy. The author of Deuteronomy. And then finally, we have the priestly author. But before I go there, do you have any questions? Okay, priestly. Priestly author. This author, a group of authors, uses the name Elohim for God up until Exodus chapter 3, when God reveals his name to Moses as Yahweh. This is part of Exodus, right? One of the things that happens in Exodus is Moses comes upon a burning bush on holy ground and he says, I need to know what's going on here. And he stops and God says, behold, I am being, right? I am being. I am he that exists, and my name is Yahweh. Right? He tells Moses what his name is at that point. Okay, so the priestly author goes along with Elohim up until this pivotal moment in Exodus, at which point all of the rest of the writings of the priestly authors begin to use the name of Yahweh. All right. This group of authors tend to focus upon providing texts dealing with rituals, religious ceremonies, and festivals, and worship Yahweh in the tabernacle that the Israelites built for him in the wilderness. Massive amounts of instructions are given by the priestly author for the priest and the Levites who are to assist the priest. They also provide detailed genealogies of the patriarchs. They go all the way back to the book of Genesis and they begin inserting all of these genealogies so that you can tell where Noah came from and then who lived after Noah and how we get to Abraham. This is all the work of these priestly authors. Aaron, the brother of Moses, in the writings of the priestly authors is frequently shown to be his equal, if not even more important than Moses. Based upon the content of the priestly writings, Wellhausen believed that this work was composed during the period of the Babylonian captivity. All right, let's go on here. Just a little bit of the history of the Israelites. You remember that the northern kingdom, we go back to the northern kingdom. The northern kingdom comes to an end in the year 722 when the Assyrians come down and they literally just wipe out the northern kingdom. They're the 10 lost tribes. They simply are taken into captivity and disappear. The reason that Judah is spared is because Judah is pretty much a backwater at the time. It's really the northern kingdom with all of these entrepôts and trading centers. It's very wealthy and it's much more prosperous than the southern kingdom. So it's wiped out in the year 722. However, the southern kingdom is going to suffer the same fate under the Babylonians. Right? Nebuchadnezzar and those people, they are going to invade and they are going to crush the kingdom of Judah in the year 587, and they are going to take many of the Jews into the kingdom of Babylonia, where they are going to remain for the better part of 50 years. And you can see the dispersion here, this green. This is what happens to the Israelites from the kingdom of the northern kingdom of Israel, right? This is the kingdom of Assyria up in here. And then a little bit later, about 2.5 centuries later, then the Babylonians come in and they wipe out many of the people here down in the kingdom of Judah, and they take them over here to Babylon, where they are in captivity for the better part of 50, and almost, if given all the deportations, maybe even 60 years or so. Okay, that's just basic Jewish history. The other thing I want to point out is, it's at this time during the Babylonian captivity that the Israelites, right, they're called the Israelites, okay, up until this point, but then they start to be called Jews because they are from Judah, right? This is the tribe from Judah, and they start to be called Jews at this point. But you'll find them referred to in the Bible as Israelites because they are the son of Jacob, who is Israel, right? And they are the Israelites, okay? But it's not until around the year 550 or so that they start to be called Jews. Okay? So there's a little clearing up of that nomenclature. All right, so Wellhausen argues then that the priestly sources come from this time during the Babylonian captivity, when the Jews, the temple is destroyed, right? The temple of Solomon is destroyed. The priests and the Levites and all the educated people, the upper classes, they're all deported over to Babylon. And he argues then that this work was composed when the Hebrew people are living in the Babylonian Empire. Okay, and these texts, he argues, serve several purposes, and they're being written in by the priests and by the Levites living in Babylon. First of all, if they are God's chosen people, if they belong to Yahweh, why did this happen to them? Right? Why did this happen to them? And so what the priestly source is trying to do is to make sense out of why this happens. At the same time, in other words, because they sinned badly against God, right? And God is punishing them. That's Jeremiah rants and raves about all this. You've got to, if you don't stop, God is going to destroy you. Isaiah does the same thing. All right. Secondly, to remind them that even though they're in captivity, that they are God's chosen people, and so the priestly documents, the priestly texts, emphasize the covenants that God has made with the Hebrews, right? With the Israelites. These texts also explain what they needed to do in order to be freed from bondage. What are we going to have to do in order to regain our freedom and go back to the promised land? And the priestly documents make it very clear. You have to observe numerous rituals and festivals and ceremonies. In other words, don't forget that you are Israelites, right? You have to do what you should have been doing all along. Also, there's an emphasis upon sacrifices made to Yahweh. You need to continue the sacrifices that you've made to Yahweh that have been going on for years and years. And there's also a tremendous emphasis in these priestly documents upon purity, right? Separate yourself from other people. Don't intermingle with these other people. Make yourself, adhere to all of these rituals and sacrifices and commandments. And if you do sin, offer up a sacrifice for your sin. So this is what you have to do in order to please Yahweh and in order to make it back to the promised land. All right, elements of this text, that is the priestly author, are now found in Genesis and Exodus, and make up all of Leviticus and much of Numbers. This explains why Leviticus focuses upon laws and rituals, right? If you want to get back to the promised land, this is what you've got to do. And they're instructing the priests. This is what a Levite, right? This is what the book of Leviticus is about. It's instructing the Levites, that is the priests, this is what you have to do in order to help your people get back to the promised land. The work of a priestly author or group of priestly scribes makes up 45% of the Torah. That's amazing, isn't it? 45% of the Torah, and it hardly ever gets read by us. The Jews read it all the time, but we don't, because it just is, it's hard to slog through this. All right, any questions about this? Bernadette, you look like you want to ask a question.
What is going on in other parts of the world when it comes to religion at this time? Just curious. Are there other religions happening?
Oh gosh, yeah. To put this in context, okay, to put this all in context, the date given most often for the exodus out of Egypt is right around the year 1200 BCE, okay? And right around 1200 BCE is when the Greeks, led by Agamemnon and Menelaus, sail over and sack the city of Troy. Okay, right around the Trojan War, right around the year 1200. We have archaeological evidence for this. It's not a fairy tale. It actually happened. Okay. If we fast forward to this period right here, right around the term of the exile, right around 500, the Greek city-states are flourishing. Rome is flourishing as well, and they are worshiping gods like Zeus and Jupiter and Minerva and Juno and people like that. Polytheistic. They're all polytheistic. This is what makes the Israelites stand out, because they turned to monotheism in a polytheistic world. right? Yeah,
And
this is
Egypt is, what are the Egyptians there?
all the Egyptians. This is also much of the story picks up during what's called the New Kingdom, the age of the empire in Egypt. And Egypt has managed to conquer all of this territory up and through here, and they run into another empire called the Hittites up here, right? And they're vying for control of this area and through here with the Hittites. But the Egyptians have they're polytheistic as well. And this is interesting because if you read the Ten Commandments, what the Ten Commandments do not say is, I am the only God out there. The Ten Commandments start out by saying, thou shalt not have any other gods. Right? Okay? Yeah. The Ten Commandments recognize that there are other gods out there. The other thing that's interesting is the Ten Commandments say, don't make any images of me. Well, why not? Well, because you're going to be traveling around, and you might not be able to carry these with you. Okay? And the other thing is, the idea of God is He just essence and being and just, pure, what? Essential, what? Being. Yeah, being. Not located in any one place. This is the thing, when Yahweh says, I am that I am, He doesn't say, I'm the God of Egypt, I'm the God of the Holy Lands. He doesn't say, I'm the God of Syria. He says, I am being. I am everywhere. I'm not located in one place. Fascinating. Anyway, we gotta go. Okay, any other questions? It's fascinating stuff. Okay, so there we go. According to Wellhausen, and this is what you were all waiting for, there's Wellhausen right there. You see that?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, here is the Yahwist and the Elohist sources right here. The two oldest sources, they are combined to become the Yahwist and the Elohist sources right here. At the same time, we have Deuteronomy coming out right around 600 or so. It's a separate text. It really is a separate text. It really doesn't fit in with any of these others. And then we have the priestly text being written right here. When they come back from the exile, what Wellhausen argues is that there is an editor or a redactor, priest probably, who combine all of these together. Combine all of these together and throw in Deuteronomy at the end to make the Torah. Okay. That's what Wellhausen says. Okay. Well.
Is there something separate then that's the DH off to the right?
Oh, well, because Deuteronomy is later. Because Deuteronomy it's originally written under King Josiah back around 600 or so, but they had to keep updating it because bad things keep happening to the Israelites, and they have to make sense out of that. So they detected a number of layers in Deuteronomy as well. Okay, well, that was 19th century scholarship. What does modern scholarship have to say all about this? Okay, for the last 40 years or so, and you will be, I think, happy to know that they don't throw out Wellhausen, but rather what they do is try to refine Wellhausen. And a lot of this has to do not just with textual study, but also with archaeology as well. A lot of the interpretation, the textual interpretation of the Torah is being what? Either correlated with or brought up against archaeological evidence or the search for archaeological evidence. So modern scholarship for the last 40 years or so. Biblical scholars, led by John Van Cedar at the University of North Carolina, have revised Wellhausen's documentary hypothesis. He posited what has come to be called the supplementary hypothesis. There are his books. It's this one right here, the Pentateuch, a social science commentary, which really sort of reshaped the field. And then Abraham, he follows Abraham through the text of the Pentateuch as well. All right. Led by John Van Cedar at the University of North Carolina, modern scholars, biblical scholars, have revised Wellhausen's documentary hypothesis and come up with what's called the supplementary hypothesis. Essentially, he argues, and you'll like this, that there were only 3 authors. It's not quite as complicated as we thought. Cedar argues that the original text of the Pentateuch was actually, and this is what you're not going to like, Deuteronomy. Okay? That Deuteronomy was actually the first text that was written probably around the year 640, somewhere in there. Okay? He argues and he agrees that it was written during the reign of King Josiah in the kingdom of Judah. And he says this text laid the basic framework for the worship of Yahweh in Judah. Right? Yahweh. This is what Deuteronomy is all about. Yahweh alone. Cedars argue that the Elohist writings were never an independent text. Remember that Wellhausen argued they were written down in the northern kingdom and they made their way down into the southern kingdom, and then they were incorporated. That text was incorporated into the writings of the Yahwist author. He argues that they were never written down into a text at all, but rather they were oral tradition and stories. And when the northern kingdom then was destroyed, that these things made their way down into the southern kingdom, but they never represented an independent text. It was rather the Yahwist author who, knowing these stories, put those in as he was writing his text as well. Okay, so that's why we don't have the E up here, the Elohist. We've just got the Yahwist, but within the Yahwist corpus was the writings of the Elohist. The writings of the Elohist. Okay. Cedars argues that the Yahwist text was composed during the time of the Babylonian captivity. This is very late. Okay, it's not to say that the stories and many of the traditions that are found in the Yahwist text didn't exist earlier, and they could go back. They could go back all the way to the 700s, but they weren't written down until the Babylonian captivity. Okay, so a very late date. Very late date. Okay. And he also, and part of this is, he bases this on the fact that there are many parallels between Babylonian and Mesopotamian, other Mesopotamian ideas about creation and the great flood and things like this that you find in the book of Genesis and Exodus as well. And so he says that what we have here is a larger Mesopotamian influence, so these stories were probably not written down until the Israelites were over in Babylon. Okay. He says that this Yahwist text was written to remind the captives of their relationship to Yahweh, written to give them hope, and written to provide a sense of cohesion and unity. All right. Cedars also believe that the priestly writer scribes were active only after the return of the exiles to Judah. That would be after 538, down until around 450 or so. And he argues, and this is why it's called the supplemental hypothesis, he argues that there never was an independent P source, but rather what these priestly authors did was they looked at J and E right here, and what they did was they went, let me rephrase that. There was an independent P source, some of them like Leviticus, but when they're dealing with J and E, what they did was they simply inserted at various places the material that they wanted to use to reshape the Torah. To fit this new, just really crisis situation that they find themselves in, right? Coming back to the land of Yehud, this is what the Persians called Judah. Yehud, right? And this is where they use, right? The Jews live in Yehud, right? And coming back, then they're no longer an independent country. They're under the power of the Persians. They don't even have a king. They're clients of the great Persian Empire right here. All right, so he says that the priestly writers didn't. I shouldn't say that they never wrote an independent standalone text, because certainly Leviticus and Numbers, much of that is their own work. But they took the narrative provided by the combined works of the Yahwist and the Elohist writers and inserted numerous texts and additions to flesh out and reframe the narrative, reframe it to serve the circumstances in which they now found themselves. In addition to adding supplements to the text of the Yahwist and the Elohist in Genesis and Exodus and Leviticus, the priestly writers wrote the entire book of Leviticus. I should say Numbers. He identified the contributions of the priestly writers as follows: 20% of Genesis, 50% of Exodus. Remember, they are reworking these texts. 100% of Leviticus and 75% of Numbers, for a total of 45% of the Torah. So they really, because they're the ones who come at it last, they're the ones who really shape what we know as the Torah. The priestly writers. And they managed to put together what appears to be a continuous narrative for us. Right? It has a beginning, it has a middle, and it has an end. Okay. The aim of the priestly writers, according to Van Cedars, was threefold: to help the Jews cope with life under the control of the Persians. Okay, the Jews were under the control, the domination of the Persians. The priestly writers tried to explain to the Jews how they, the chosen people of God, had become enslaved and were now under the control of the Persians. The priestly writers also attempted to explain to the Jews how they could once again gain their freedom by obeying Yahweh. Emphasis upon rituals and festivals, emphasis upon daily and monthly sacrifices in the rebuilt temple in Jerusalem, which was carried out by the priests. Second goal, to help solidify the authority and control of the priests and the Levites who have now returned to Judah. Remember, there's no king in Judah anymore, and the task of running this country now falls to the priests and the Levites. And this is one way these priests and Levites, and if you read the genealogies, can trace their families all the way back to Aaron and Moses. All the way back to Aaron and Moses. This is done in Exodus. Okay? All right. Let's see. To help the Jews gain some independence from the Persians, this is what Van Cedar argues. He says the Persians were willing to allow the Jews some self-rule and independence if they could produce a suitable law code by which they would live. This is the Torah. This is what the Torah was. It was reworked by the priestly writers, and it provides just such a law code. It would further enhance the power of the priest and the Levites in the post-exilic period. According to Van Cedars, then, the composition of the Torah, that is the written Torah, took place from the 7th century through the 5th, from 640 down to 440. This is not to say that elements of it don't go all the way back much further. They just weren't written down. All right. What are the implications of all this for our study of Exodus? First of all, and this is because we're studying Exodus, it's interesting that both of these authors situate the writing of Exodus either during the exile or right after the exile, during a time of crisis, during a great time of crisis when the Israelites are being held against their will, or just have been released, okay? Both of them see the book of Exodus as a composite source of three authors, the Yahwist, the Elohist, and the priestly. And both men see the book of Exodus in its final form as a response to the crisis and challenges caused by the Babylonian captivity. The relationship between the Jews and Yahweh established in Exodus and in Leviticus and Numbers will dominate Judaism right down until the time of Jesus. Jesus' teachings are in no small part a response to the focus upon temple worship and sacrifice found in the Torah. Okay, and I'm going to leave you with this thought. Given the goals of the priestly authors, was there really an Exodus from Egypt? To find that out, we have to come back next week.
Thank you.
There is a noise.
It's a fan. There's a blower.
Terrible. I think this is
You know what we should do? Because
Can we not turn that off?
it should be turned off during the
Yeah.